It only takes 1 week for everything to change. We've had injuries, we've had surprise breakouts, we've had disappointing busts and everything in between. But it's time to focus on the future and update your roster to ensure it's all set for a week 2 win. Every week, I'll be bringing you the answer to two simple questions: who should I stream this week, and who should I stash for the future on the Fantasy First Down? I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down and the Week 2 Streamer and Stash Show. Today, we're talking about all the players you need to stick in your lineup for this week, especially, and the stashes you should be popping on your bench. If you haven't already, it'd be great if you could like and subscribe on YouTube. Plus, if you have any questions, hit us up on the comments or on Instagram or Twitter. You can also check out my rankings over at ffdfantasyfootball.com. To keep things simple, we'll define a streamer as any player you wouldn't usually start who's a viable option for this week. They may be on your bench or they may be on waivers, depending on your league. We'll also define a stash as any player you can potentially find on waivers that you should stash for the future, either because they have a favorable matchup coming up or because they could become a future fantasy starter. I do this assuming that your waivers have already run. These are guys that could still be available or you may have on your bench. We're going to start things off talking about quarterbacks, and a guy I talked about a lot during the preseason unexpectedly boomed in a tough Steelers matchup in week 1. Justin Fields finished as the QB2 and now gets a juicy opportunity for a sequel against the Bills. This is the same Bills defense that Lamar Jackson ran all over before a passive ending to the game gave Buffalo the win. I'd expect the Jets to be chasing the game all day, meaning a whole lot of Fields production. I'll be ranking him well within my top 10. And if he's not available, well, it only took JJ McCarthy a couple of quarters to settle into his NFL debut, but he looked every bit the fantasy asset I expected while ranking him pretty darn high this preseason. I had him close to my top 12 at times. This week, he gets a generous Falcons defense who have a number of seasons been weaker against the pass than against the run. I would expect another solid performance from a QB available in the majority of leagues. And if you'd rather a quarterback stash, well, Daniel Jones is your guy. In week 1, the Colts demolished a Dolphins defense that was most frugal to opposing quarterbacks last season. Well, how that has changed. Sure, they've had some significant downgrades, but it has to be acknowledged that the Indy version of Jones, Indiana Jones, look far better than what we saw in New York. Indianapolis gets the tough Broncos defense this week, so I wouldn't start Jones against them unless you're desperate, but he's certainly well worth the stash. Now, running backs. And, well, the Giants have been weak against the run for a couple of years now, and that continued in week 1. This week, it's Javonte Williams who gets the juicy matchup. He was fantastic against the Eagles last week and will hopefully be on your bench after I mentioned him as a great stash option at this time last week. Plus, I was all about him during the preseason. He was well within my top 30 when most people ranked him around 40th. So this is the matchup to slot him into your lineup if you have him. Now, let's imagine a situation where you're desperate for a starter in a deep league and you've just got no one available. If you're in a real pickle at running back, well, you can do worse than Kenny Gainwell. The Steelers face a Seahawks defense that conceded the second most points to running backs last week. Now, admittedly, that was CMC, so it's hardly an even competition, but it does indicate that a team willing to run the ball can have success against Seattle. And we know the Steelers love their running backs. And who was their starter last week? Wasn't Caleb Johnson. I told you about that during the preseason, and unsurprisingly, he played a total of 2 snaps. It also wasn't Jalen Warren, despite his good performance. It was Kenny G, who started the game and finished with the most snaps played. He's a highly risky but potentially solid week 2 desperation start available in most leagues. As for stashes for running backs, well, Zach Charbonnet is my favorite. Last week in the Seahawks game, he had the most snaps, the most routes, the most rushes, and twice as many yards per touch than Kenneth Walker. Yes, Walker is recovering from an injury, but Charbonnet looks primed to become the Seattle starter. He's a must-stash if you can get your hands on him, as we know how much upside he has when given the opportunity to be an every-down guy. He gets a tough matchup this week, but long-term, I love the upside. And it's not a surprise because I do love the upside of stashing any player that is an injury away from fantasy relevance and fantasy stardom. Running backs get injured more than any other player in fantasy, with the average top 36 running backs missing 2 games per season in fantasy. For that reason, your best bet in fantasy is to roster running backs who are an injury away from an every down role. Each week, I'll be listing my favorite running back stashes, only including players who wouldn't be starting most weeks, but will start if things go their way. I'm going to start things off with Jordan Mason, who's nearly the starter. It's kind of a 50-50 split with Aaron Jones, and he's not going to be available in the majority of leagues, but if he's available in yours, certainly pick up Mason, and Zach Charbonnet fits in that same category. As for other guys who are an injury away, Brian Robinson, DJ Giddens, 2 of my favorite guys. We know that their offenses are very run heavy, and they are the clear number 1 guy if there's an injury. Rashad White, similar situation. If Bucky Irving goes down, he's someone you'll want to own. Braylon Allen and Ray Davis are a little bit more productive right now. They won't get all of the receiving work if there's an injury to the number 1 there, but they'll still become very good fantasy starters and could arguably be top 15 guys. Trey Benson is in a similar situation. He gets the benefit now of doing the receiving work, which means he's probably going to become an every down back if there's a James Conner injury. Blake Corum, similarly, the clear number 1 guy, with Jaquez Hunter not even active on game day. Najee Harris is a good one. Rico Dowdle. Kendre Miller's solid, although Devin Neal's still hanging around. Caleb Johnson at least has some upside. I do think ultimately that we will see if Jalen Warren goes down, that Johnson becomes startable at least. Ollie Gordon's a good option until we see a Jalen Wright injury. And Kareem Hunt, I don't mind as a solid option. And he is someone that you can start if you're desperate on a bye week, because he's still getting a fair amount of touches and third down work for KC. Now let's talk wide receivers. And Ricky Pearsall is the guy in San Francisco with injuries to Juwan Jennings and George Kittle, making all the difference. Pearsall will be in prime position to be the top 49ers receiver alongside Christian McCaffrey in week 2. The Saints were a top 10 matchup for wide receivers last week, making Pearsall a solid start if you have him available on your bench. He's unlikely to be available on waivers now. The Chiefs also have a real lack of receivers, with Xavier Worthy injured and Rashee Rice suspended. Hollywood Brown was the clear slot guy and has fantastic floor in PPR leagues. If Worthy's out, he's a must-start. But even if Worthy plays, I still like Brown to have a solid game in this matchup, as I do think the Chiefs are probably going to have to pass the ball a fair amount. As for stashes, well, last week, my stashes were Quinton Johnston and Cedric Tillman. I think we saw how they panned out. If anything, they could have even been streaming options. They're still great options, but I wanted to add some variety. So here's 2 more. Last year's dynasty darling Troy Franklin finally got a proper opportunity to start in week 1, surprisingly playing in the majority of snaps and playing ahead of Marvin Mims, which I did not see coming. There's an upside wide receiver 2 role in the making here, but it's unclear if Franklin or Mims grows into it. So I'm stashing both to see what happens. Mims was the guy I was expecting to be the wide receiver 2, but I think because he's doing kick returns, they're not willing to just put him straight back out there into the lineup, and he's taking a couple of snaps off, which is really helping Franklin. Meanwhile, rookie Alec Imanol was the clear wide receiver 2 for the Titans in week 1. It may take a while before this becomes a valuable role for fantasy, but he's worth stashing in deeper leagues to see if he can emerge as the alpha in an offense with plenty of upside in games where they can't just lean on Tony Pollard. Calvin Ridley is well into his 30s and could fade during the season. That means if Campbell can get things together and Titans can look better than they did in week 1, then Imanol becomes a viable start. He's definitely not right now, though. Now, tight ends, and gosh, it was a messy week for tight ends. Unsurprisingly, a couple of guys really struggled. I called the Colston Loveland thing before the season, and Evan Ingram. They were both guys that said you do not want on your roster, but we can't control things like George Kittle's injury, and David Njoku losing a lot of snaps is also a bit of a surprise. So a lot of us indeed, are desperate for a starting tight end. I think we've got one with the Saints. The Saints finally gave a tight end an every down role, with Juwan Johnson playing all but 1 snap and attracting 11 targets. Given all the injuries and issues at tight end, I'm considering Johnson a solid streaming option this week, with the hope he can turn into an every week starter, despite the tricky matchup. I'd start him over guys like Loveland and Ingram and Zach Ertz and Dalton Kincaid and a whole heap of other guys. That's just to name a few. You'll have to check out the rankings on my website in the coming days to see who else. Meanwhile, the Chiefs have been a great tight end matchup for a while now. And while that didn't plan out last week, the Chargers still had more tight end targets than usual. This week, I'm anticipating a solid performance from Dallas Goedert again as the Chiefs attempt to shut down the Eagles' strong run game. Meanwhile, there's also a good stash option in Harold Fannin Jr. We learnt last week why you shouldn't jump on last year on why you shouldn't jump on a young tight end who breaks out week one. Harold Fannin Jr. could easily just be another Isaiah Likely, but it's likewise possible the Browns plan to use a two tight end heavy approach with Fannin, the clear receiver of the two, for the rest of the season. We've kind of seen the Steelers doing something similar. That would give him fantastic weekly upside, as we saw against the Bengals what he could do. But until we see it more consistently, I can't recommend starting the rookie, especially given David Njoku is still playing the vast majority of snaps as he always has. Now let's talk kickers and DST. Will Lutz is an accurate kicker in an offense that attempts a solid amount of field goals. The Broncos will enter week 2 favorites in what could be a little bit of a grind fest, making this a risky upside play, but given the possible lack of extra point floor, I'm still willing to start him because I do think we're going to see a lot of field goals, and I think the Broncos could be better this week. If you want a little bit more security when it comes to extra points, well, remember last week when I said you should start kickers against the Panthers and it panned out really well with Cam Little? Well, let's do it again. Chad Ryland and the Cardinals take on the Panthers, and I would happily start Ryland and am doing in a number of leagues. And remember just a second ago when I mentioned the value of starting players against the Panthers? Well, that goes for DSTs too. The Cardinals remain a solid DST for this week as they take on the Panthers. Meanwhile, the Colts defense tore the Dolphins to shreds, and the Patriots are a far better defense, in my opinion. I like their chance in week 2 of a solid performance in what should be a low-scoring game. Also note, I won't be listing kickers or DST stashes because, and listen carefully to this, you should never put a kicker or DST on your bench, at least until the final week or 2 of the season. Just don't do it. There are no exceptions. And that's all we've got for the Streamers and Stashes show of week 2. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And I look forward to seeing you guys in the coming days. Please make sure you check out our rankings. If you've got any questions, you know where to find me. Look forward to hearing from you.